So folks, today we are going to talk, we'll remind you that you know some things about chromosomes, and we'll add in the idea of how your endocrine system plays a role with reproduction. So to start with, I just want to remind you that you should know at this point that someone who is male genetically has an X and a Y chromosome, and someone who is female has an X and an X chromosome. Now, did you know that until about 7 weeks of development, male and female embryos are basically identical? They don't look different. Female is like the default program for a human embryo. If a person has a Y chromosome, it has a gene that causes differentiation of male structures. And the reason that this happens is that when this gene is expressed, testosterone is produced. Now, differentiation is something we'll talk about more in the next lesson when we talk about the development of an embryo. But because actually people talked about it today in Ben's presentation, he talked about differentiation of blood cells into other types of stem cells into other cells. Differentiation is when a cell decides or determines what kind of cell it's going to be. So when some signal tells it what to do, you'll see that, or maybe you'll remember that, when a sperm fertilizes an egg, it's just one cell, and that one cell can give rise to all of the other cells that make up the human organism. So there's a gene on the Y chromosome that will cause differentiation. It will make the cells different instead of being the same. Now, since a hormone is kind of the reason that differentiation happens here, we need to talk about how in a male the endocrine system plays some sort of role. This is the basic pathway, and if you look at that, it looks the same as a lot of the other endocrine pathways we looked at, where the hypothalamus is the starting point, then the pituitary. Now, we're specifically talking about the anterior pituitary here. And in this case, the testes are the target organ, target tissue for the hormones from the anterior pituitary. So we just need to be specific about which hormones are coming from each of those places. The hypothalamus makes a hormone whose abbreviation is GnRH. It's one of the ones that shows up on your data sheet. And if you look, you'll see that it's called gonadotropin releasing hormone. In most other cases, we just said that the hypothalamus makes a releasing factor and we didn't give it a name. This is one of the few cases where you are required to know the name of the releasing factor, like it's on your data sheet. Now, unlike a lot of the other hypothalamus releasing factors, GnRH stimulates two different hormones in the anterior pituitary. It stimulates FSH. Now, the abbreviation FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone. And it's one of the ones that's on your data sheet. And you're going to look at that name and say, well, that's a dumb name. Where's the follicle in the male reproductive system? But when we get onto the female reproductive system, you'll see that its name is very appropriate because the follicle is the structure. It's not the greatest name here, but because these hormones have basically the same function in males and females, it is the thing that is stimulating the differentiation of germ cells into eventually the gamete that we're going to produce. So very specifically, if we're talking in the testes, FSH is going to stimulate not just any part of the testes, but in particular the seminiferous tubules. In the seminiferous tubules, hopefully you remember, that's where spermatogenesis is happening. So FSH is stimulating spermatogenesis. Now the seminiferous tubules can also make a hormone called inhibin. And inhibin can have negative feedback on FSH. So just like with a lot of other hormones, there's negative feedback control. Now, so far, does anyone want to ask any questions about this hormone pathway? Now, I said GnRH, gonadotropin-releasing hormone, actually stimulates two different hormones from the anterior pituitary. The other one is LH. L and H stand for luteinizing hormone. And again, you're going to look at this and be like, what is this referring to in the male reproductive system? But we'll talk about the female reproductive system, and you'll be like, oh, well, this one has a really appropriate name. And since they have a similar function in males and females, they have the same name in both males and females. LH isn't going to stimulate the seminiferous tubules. It's going to stimulate a different part of the testes. One of the things that we labeled way back when, was an interstitial cell. The interstitial cell might sometimes be referred to as a Leydig cell. The diploma will call it an interstitial cell. But the interstitial cells, they're the ones that are outside of the seminiferous tubules. So we labeled Sertoli cells inside of the seminiferous tubules that help with sperm development. And then interstitial cells outside of them. Interstitial cells produce testosterone. Now, testosterone can do a few things. Testosterone will have a positive influence on spermatogenesis. Testosterone will be responsible for secondary sex characteristics. And testosterone can have negative feedback on LH, can have negative feedback on GnRH. So it would be important for you to be able to say, fill in a missing piece in this pathway. If I said, the hypothalamus makes GnRH, which stimulates something, which stimulates spermatogenesis, you should be able to fill in the blank that it's FSH that's doing that. You should be able to associate LH with the production of testosterone. You should recognize that FSH and LH have different target tissues inside of the testes, so a different part of them is being affected by FSH versus LH. And you should also recognize that GnRH stimulates both of them. So if something is inhibiting GnRH, it will be inhibiting both FSH and LH production, generally not just one of them. Now, this whole pathway, what's going on here, is generally what is happening from puberty until death. Men have the capacity, males have the capacity to produce reproductive hormones and gametes for basically their entire adult life. Now, as with everything, it's not true in every single case. And there is something called andropause. Maybe you've never heard of it, but maybe you've heard of its partner menopause, which is a lot more common. Andropause is something that not all men experience. So it's not as common, it's not as easy to detect, it's not as frequent as what happens with female. But if we look at the word andro and pause, andro is referring to androgens. It's a pretty generic word for male sex hormones, and pause means stop. So andropause is a decline in sex hormone production. Now, the main site of production of sex hormones will be in the reproductive system, but like Ali's presentation mentioned, don't forget about your adrenal gland. Because we were going to talk about reproductive hormones here, I didn't delve into them a ton there, but your adrenal gland makes glucocorticoids, or mineralocorticoids and corticosteroids. So there's lots of different types of hormones coming from your adrenal gland. So even though we're focusing on testosterone being made in the testes, there are also steroid hormones that are being made in the adrenal gland. Now, what can happen because of this? It could lead to an enlarged prostate. It could lead to decreased sperm count. And a possible treatment could be hormone replacement. Like I said, this is not a common thing that would typically occur in all males, so this doesn't happen all the time. If it's really causing symptoms that are causing discomfort or other issues, then it might be worth the person's while to replace the hormones that they're missing. But like Ali said in her presentation, too much hormone injection could lead to some pretty negative outcomes. So you want to make sure it's a healthcare professional who is guiding your hormone replacement. So we're going to take a look at what's going on with female endocrine system. Just like for male, this is happening starting at puberty, but I'm not going to say until death, I'm going to say until menopause. Because it's finite, what's going on with the female reproductive system. Now, like with a male, we start with the hypothalamus that produces GnRH. The anterior pituitary, just like with the male, produces FSH and produces LH. Now, I already wrote down what the abbreviations are. FSH is follicle stimulating hormone. LH is luteinizing hormone. In a female, FSH will cause the development and maturation of a follicle. So its name is very appropriate because that's what it's stimulating. And the follicle is the structure that contains the egg, or we could also call it the ovum. Ova is plural for ovum, but we're talking about the same structure the whole time, the female gamete. Now, when FSH stimulates the follicle to develop and to mature, the follicle itself will start making estrogen. It'll make a little bit of the other hormone, progesterone, but it's mainly estrogen at this point, so it's the only one that I'm going to write down. And estrogen does something weird. Sometimes it gives negative feedback, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it gives positive feedback. So, unlike basically every other scenario where the hormone provided negative feedback on the structures that produce it, Estrogen will provide negative feedback on FSH, but it could provide negative or positive feedback on GnRH, depending which part of the cycle we are in. Now the other hormone, LH, still stimulates something in the ovaries, but a different structure. FSH is stimulating a follicle, the little structure that contains an egg. LH is the hormone that stimulates ovulation. So the release of the egg from the ovary. And if you just look at that, you might say, I still don't see why it's called LH. Where is that L coming from? Well, once the egg is released, what's left of the follicle is called the corpus luteum, and that is where luteinizing in the luteinizing hormone comes from. So this structure that's left once the egg is released, what's left of the follicle, is called corpus luteum, which is where you can see the link to the name. The corpus luteum produces a hormone called progesterone, as well as estrogen. Progesterone and estrogen can both have negative feedback at this point. Now, progesterone has its main effects in the uterus, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail on the next couple of slides. Estrogen does a couple of things. It has an effect on the uterus, but also on secondary sex characteristics. So back in the first lesson, I said that there were secondary sex characteristics. So in males, testosterone is responsible for those, and in females, estrogen is the main hormone that's responsible. Now these are our basic hormones. GnRH causes FSH and LH to be produced. Then estrogen and progesterone are being produced in the ovary. But like I said, estrogen doesn't always do the same thing. And so we have to talk about, over time, what's happening, which would bring us to a discussion of the menstrual cycle. Now, when we think about a menstrual cycle, typically it is 28 days or so. Now, every textbook and document will say this is how long it's supposed to be, but if you talk to a female person who has a menstrual cycle, I bet you she'll tell you it is never perfect. And if you know someone who says they have a perfect 28-day cycle, I would like to meet them because there are so many things that can impact this slightly. So we are going to study what it is supposed to be. All of the days will be based on this 28-day cycle, but just keep in mind, for a real person, this might shift a little bit. When we consider every 28 days of a female who has hit puberty's life until she reaches menopause, we could consider the ovarian cycle. In other words, what happens in the ovary. And that's what this first picture is trying to show you. If we were to look at an ovary over time, we might see the progression of images that you see here. So if this is, let's say, day 1 of her cycle, and then we continued to look at what was happening inside of the ovary each progressive day and we added to the picture, we would see that this little section here is basically day 1 to 14. So the first half of the cycle, if you look at what's happening, we took a primary follicle, tiny little undeveloped follicle. It developed until you could clearly see that there was an ovum, so that there was an egg. The follicular phase then is what we call day 1 to 14, and it's called that because it is when the follicle develops. Now, there will be a spot on any picture of what's going on with an ovary where you will see, like you see here, an ovum coming out of the ovary. This is ovulation, and this is supposed to happen on day 14, right in the middle. Now, once the ovum is released from the follicle, see how the follicle was ruptured, but there's still a structure there? The ruptured follicle becomes the corpus luteum. Luteum means yellow. Sometimes people will call it just the yellow body. Corpus means body, luteum means yellow, yellow body. But it's what remains of the follicle after the egg has left the follicle. And so down here, this would be the other half of the cycle, so day 15 to 28. And that's what we call the luteal phase, because that's when the corpus luteum is there. Now, my picture went in clockwise direction. You started at the top and went around. There is absolutely not a rule that that's how a picture has to look. It would not be impossible for a different diagram to appear where the structures were going in counterclockwise order, because we're just showing time lapse here. Over time, if we were to look at an ovary, here are some things that we would see. Remember that there are ovaries on both sides, so here I'm kind of looking as if I'm looking at the one that's on the left side, but if I flipped it over, it would be happening on the right. So please don't assume that the position of everything has to stay where it is. Now, like I said before, day 1 to 14, when the follicle is developing, the main hormone that we have here is estrogen. Down here, we have estrogen and progesterone being produced. And that was like what I wrote on the previous slide. Now, does anyone want to ask any questions about this diagram? So if we could just make the link between what's happening in the ovary and those hormones. I said that estrogen does more than one thing. Here, estrogen production isn't the same the whole time. As the follicle gets bigger, more and more estrogen gets produced. And the estrogen, as its level increases, starts to have a positive effect on GnRH. When it's in lower amounts, it doesn't have this positive effect, but as it increases, because the follicle is getting bigger, there's lots of GnRH. The reason that on day 14 ovulation happens is because there is an FSH and LH spike. because of the positive effect that estrogen is having on GnRH. Now, does anyone want to ask anything about that? I just want to be clear, like this is the surface that I'm brushing here, and there's a lot of detailed explanations that we could go into. So if you feel like you're interested in this, I would be happy to delve deeper, but this is what you have to know. This is the basics. Now, if we compare what's happening in the ovary over the same period of time to what's happening in the uterus, we have the uterine cycle. Now, the uterus is not the place that the hormones are being made. It's also not the place that the gametes are being made. But the uterus is the place where if the egg were to be fertilized, it needs to develop. So things happen in the uterus in parallel with the ovary. The follicular phase is day 1 to 14, and luteal 15 to 28. So if we take a look at the picture at what's happening, the picture on the bottom is representing the thickness. You'll notice there are no numbers for the thickness because no one expects you to memorize some actual measurement for thickness. But for you to recognize the trend over time. Here's day 1, here's about day 7, here's day 14, and here would be day 28. I'm pointing these things out because this is where sort of particular things happen. If you look at day 1 through 7, see how the thickness of the uterus is decreasing? Now, what makes the uterus thick? Well, we saw way back in the first lesson that the uterus has an endometrium, the inner lining that's very vascularized, blood vessels. So, because of the development of that tissue, it's thick. Over the first 7 days or so, and this isn't a real big or so here, this is when the uterine lining gets thinner. Here, the lining is shed, and we would call this her period. So, when a woman is menstruating or having her period, she is shedding the lining of her uterus. Now, around day 7, that finishes. And then you see slowly the lining of the uterus start to increase in thickness. Now, if I ask myself, why would this be happening around day 7? Well, take a look at what's going on in the ovary. On day 1, this tiny little baby follicle, nothing's going on. But when I get to day 7, the follicle is quite a bit bigger at this point and could be producing decent amounts of estrogen. When we get to day 14, that's where ovulation happens. And notice that day 14, when ovulation happens, that's not when the uterus is its thickest. The uterus is actually its thickest somewhere in the vicinity of day 21 to 23, let's say. Right around here, it's the thickest. Now here's why. For the egg to implant itself in the uterus, it has to get there. And it takes some time for the egg to be moved from the ovary to the uterus. So the uterus is its thickest when the egg would actually get there, not when the egg is released. So this particular spot here is when the most probable implantation would take place. It's also the spot where, in a woman's cycle, if she were having some reproductive technology to assist her in becoming pregnant, maybe she was having IVF, This would be the time you would want to implant an embryo, when her uterus is at its thickest. Now, if we ask ourselves, why is the uterus its thickest here? The answer is again with the hormones. These pictures are representing the corpus luteum, which is formed and then degenerates as time passes. And we said the corpus luteum makes estrogen and progesterone. Well, it's making estrogen and progesterone, which both have the uterus as its target tissue, and that's why it's the thickest there. Now, once we get to day 28, what happens? Well, the cycle starts all over again. On day 28 at the end, estrogen and progesterone decrease. Now, why would they decrease? Well, look what's going on in the ovary. The corpus luteum is supposed to make them, but it got tinier and tinier and tinier as time passed. If there's no estrogen and progesterone, the uterine lining can't be maintained, so the woman's next period starts. Estrogen and progesterone would keep the uterus thick. If they're not being produced, the uterus sheds its lining. Now, some of you might be aware that there are birth control technologies that would include taking artificial hormones. If someone were to take the pill, the birth control pill, its job is that it maintains these levels. So instead of letting them decrease, it maintains them, tricking the woman's body into thinking that she's pregnant so that she doesn't continue to have a normal menstrual cycle. Not every pill has the same exact function. There are different versions of the birth control pill. Some of them are progesterone only. Some of them have a combination of progesterone and estrogen. There are other things besides the pill. There are things called intrauterine devices. There are all sorts of other, there's the ring thing that you can get. There are shots that you can get. So there's different versions of this. But the purpose of most of them is to maintain those levels because that's what would happen if she were pregnant. If she were pregnant, those levels would stay high. Now, just like we wrote down what andropause was for men, there's menopause for women. It happens somewhere around the age of 40 or 50. And again, it's not a set age. It sort of depends how many eggs she had. This is the end of the menstrual cycle. So what we just described stops happening. And the reason it stops happening is because there are no more follicles. In other words, there are no more eggs. You might remember that we said way back when we talked about oogenesis, that a female is born with all of the eggs she's ever going to have. They just haven't quite finished developing. Once a month, one egg develops until she runs out. And when she runs out, that is menopause. At this point, estrogen and progesterone really, really decrease a lot. Normally, they would be made by the follicle or by what's left of the follicle when ovulation happens, but she doesn't have any left. So huge decrease in levels of those hormones. It can lead to a lot of really uncomfortable side effects, mood changes, hot flashes. In this case, hormone replacement therapy is a pretty common occurrence. Not every woman will need hormone replacement therapy, but every woman will go through menopause at some point. She's going to run out. If her life happens to end before she runs out of eggs, then she won't. But if the person lives to the end of their natural life, they should go through menopause. This is just the average. For some people, it will be considerably earlier. For some people, it might be considerably later. There have been cases of women having children, giving birth to babies that are alive, where everything is fine, well past 50 years of age. So this is just the average here, not something that's set in stone. Now, what really I think is useful is to compare the ovarian, the uterine, and the hormone cycles so that you can see what's happening with all of them at the same time. So at the bottom of the page in your handout, there is this graph, but with nothing filled in on it. And I also removed the temperature bit because body temperature, although it's something that you could look at, isn't a detail that you're required to know about. So if you take a look in the top box, it's just depicting what things look like in the ovary. A follicle, then ovulation, then the corpus luteum, which eventually degenerates. If we look at anterior pituitary hormones, notice how the green line, which is FSH, spikes, but the blue line, LH, spikes even more when ovulation is happening. The green line increases in the first part of the cycle because it's the one that's stimulating the growth of the follicle. Here, estradiol is the same thing as estrogen. It's the more specific chemical name when we're talking about things, but we'll refer to them as estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen increases gradually over the follicular phase. Then it decreases, but then it starts increasing again because the corpus luteum makes it. And then the bottom one is showing more or less the same thing we just looked at with the uterus, how the lining of the uterus is thicker. It becomes thinner because the lining is shed, and then it starts to get thicker over time, and then it would start all over again once the 28 days have passed.